Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 753, Preserving Information Media lecture. We'll be looking at email and website preservation. So a couple of fairly basic weekly topics for this week. What are some considerations archivists should make when preserving emails and when preserving websites? A few things that we'll be talking about today are related to some of our previous discussions in class. We'll certainly be talking about context and metadata authenticity. So this is just kind of a broad generalization of some of the different issues that we will be discussing and that relate to preserving email and websites. Okay, so again, we'll touch on the need for preservation, whether it is analog preservation or digital preservation, although you could argue it's more important for digital preservation to preserve both the context and the content of a record. And so we'll be talking about some of the different issues related to preserving the content and context of both emails and websites during this lecture. So we'll start with preserving email content. And this can be a pretty difficult issue in a lot of ways. As the CLEAR report that we read for this week noted, oftentimes email may be viewed as a liability to be disposed of by people who are creating email. So that might reduce the overall amount of content that archivists are able to preserve. So if for some reason emails within an organization are considered to be a part of a record schedule, then there's really little incentive for people within that organization to keep them around. And there may be a lot of incentive for them, again, to get rid of them. You know, they may serve as evidence of something that an organization or a person doesn't necessarily want to be shared with the public. There may be legal risks that are involved with keeping emails. So there's a lot of incentive to not do so. And unless there is some kind of legal requirement or incentive for people to keep emails, first of all, and then eventually donate those emails to archives, then there's more of a chance that that's not going to happen, again, because of some of the incentives that people may have to get rid of emails for whatever reason. A reason why this is unfortunate is because oftentimes, because of a lack of staff and other resources, archivists depend on donors to appraise their emails prior to donation. This is something that the CLEAR report also talks about. And again, if people have an incentive to get rid of emails for whatever reason, then either they'll do so before they're appraising records, or perhaps they're looking at records that they might possibly donate to an archive, and they stumble across things and they think, oh, wow, I really don't want this to get out, so I'm going to delete this. I'm not going to include this in my donation to the archive. So this donor appraisal, while again, you know, it might be a necessity for archives because of the huge amount of emails that can be just in one person's email platform or mailbox or whatever you want to call it, it's really not possible for archivists to go through and appraise all of these records. And so oftentimes the only real way for any appraisal to take place, again, is through the donor. And if a donor has a lot of incentives to kind of whitewash things and get rid of things that might conceivably have some research value to the public or some interest to the public, then that can create another opportunity for deletions to take place, which may detract from the overall truthfulness and value of a set of emails that an archives acquires. This is particularly true because, as the CLIA report notes, emails may pose huge privacy and security risks just because of their personal nature. There's a high likelihood that there can be information contained in emails which can be, of a private nature. I've gone through emails in the past and stumbled across ones that I didn't even realize I had kept, and I was like, wow, I'd really prefer that someone doesn't see this, so I'm gonna take care of this. So a person may not even realize that there is content in their emails that is of a private nature or has some kind of personally identifying information contained within it, like financial records or social security numbers, sensitive correspondence, maybe correspondence that is of a proprietary nature. And, I think there's a lot of connection between the possibly quite personal nature of email and the incentive to get rid of it and possible reluctance to donate email to an archive. Unfortunately, it's oftentimes the private and personal stuff that really provides value to archives and value to a set of records. And again, if you're relying on donors to kind of go through and screen stuff, then they may sort of weed all of the kind of juicy bits out. And again, that can really detract from the overall value of the content of emails that an archives receives. Another thing about the content of email is that it can include attachments. And as the CLIA report notes, it's necessary to preserve not only the attachments, but also the email message that is contained within the attachment and some connection between the two. So something that points to an attachment and says, this is an attachment that was included in this email. And that's important for contextual purposes. So if you have a folder of email files and then you have a folder of attachment files and there's really no connection between the two, then it's difficult to say which file, which attachment went to which email. And obviously that's important to know. It's more related to context, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but it is important to consider the attachments as a part of the content of email, and it's important for archivists to think about how they are going to make sure that the email and the attachment stay connected into the future. Another type of content that may be present in emails is links, or are links. Is links, are links. And links can be problematic as well. As the CLIA report notes, links may be dead. They may not link to the correct materials. It's possible that the information that links point to might be behind some kind of firewall. And if the archives or the researcher looking at the email doesn't have the credentials to access that information, then that can be problematic. So links is another type of content in addition to attachments present in email that can be problematic too. And then you have things that you think of as being more typical of content. So the actual, message in an email, maybe looking at the different font used and, things that are bolded or highlighted as being important, and other features of content of email that you might more typically think of. It's important that the content of an email be adequately and accurately portrayed because, as the Clear Report notes, the content of an email can serve as a way to determine the authenticity of an email. So just looking at some of this content can allow archivists and allow researchers to determine if the email really is to and from who it says it's to, if the message seems like it hasn't been modified or changed in any way. And so it really is important to provide as an accurate portrayal of the content as possible, so that archivists and researchers alike can have at least more of confidence that the email that they're looking at, again, is an authentic email that essentially says or is what it says it is. So to talk a little bit more about the content of an email, so you'll have a header, which is where the sort of to and from information is. And obviously that's important to know, right? It's important to know, who wrote the email, who might have been forwarded in the email, when it was sent, and other content. And again, that can be really helpful to know when you're attempting to establish the authenticity of a record. Then you have the body of the email, which is where the message typically is. And then you might have the attachments as well. So again, all these things should be preserved as carefully and thoroughly as possible in order to provide the researcher with the most authentic and useful experience looking at emails and using emails for whatever purpose they have. And the prom draft article about using PDF EA for an archival email format talks more about some of the different types of information that would be contained in these particular parts of an email. So if you haven't looked at that, I would encourage you to do so. Okay, so having talked about the content for emails, next we'll talk about the context. So again, not only is it necessary to preserve the content of email, but it's very important to have this contextual information available to researchers as well. One thing that the CLEAR article or the CLEAR report notes is that emails produced by different platforms and the files that result from them may include different metadata. So the contextual information provided about an email may differ depending on the service or platform that was used to create it. And so this can result in some differences in exactly what contextual information is provided to archivists and researchers. The CLEAR report also notes that there's some uncertainty over how well formats maintain important contextual metadata. So if you have an email in a particular file, then archivists are still looking into how well these files capture metadata, which is going to be important for researchers in order to understand more about the context of emails that they're looking at. Another important aspect of context is something that I talked a little bit about earlier, which is the relationship of the attachment to the message. So again, knowing that a particular attachment is associated with a particular message or email file, and being able to have some conceptual understanding of how those two are related. And these attachments can be as important or more important than the actual message in the body itself. So there may be messages that just says, please see this attachment. And if you don't have some relationship established between the attachment and that message, then okay, we'll see which attachment. I don't know, because all I have is something here that points me to another folder that has 50 attachments in, and I don't know which one I'm supposed to be looking at in relation to this particular message. So again, it's important that archivists are able to develop the contextual relationships between two types of content that may be found within an email. Another thing that's important for archivists to maintain, as the CLEAR report also notes, is threaded replies. So being able to demonstrate that a particular email is in response to other emails, and also showing what the preceding emails are. Because again, if you have an email that says in the body, in response to your earlier email, but you don't know what that earlier email said, then it really diminishes the value of the email that you're looking at. So maintaining these threaded replies is also important for helping establish the context of emails. Another thing that we talked about before was links and link data. And this can also be an important contextual tool or indicator that researchers will want to know. And as the CLEAR report notes, sometimes link data may not be considered a part of the email message. So it may not be considered part of the content of an email, but that doesn't mean that it's not important for contextual purposes. As I mentioned before, there might be some limitations to providing data contained in links to researchers. The data might not have been preserved. As I talked about before, it might be behind a firewall, or it might require some kind of credential to access it. And this can create a lot of issues for archivists. Again, if there is, an email that says, please see this link, and so on and so on, but you're not able to actually access the information contained in the link that is provided in the content of the email. Another thing the archivist should do according to the prom drafted report is to preserve emails in the structure of use. So to show researchers which email or which folder an email might have been in. So was it in the sent folder? Was it in the inbox? Was it in a folder that was maybe labeled important work stuff? Or what was the organization of the email used by the user of the email? What was the original order of the email? And again, that's important for context. It's important to know how different emails within a person's collection were organized, because that can give researchers clues about how the emails might be related to each other, what they might have been used for, why they might have been created and sent, and all the other yummy contextual information that archivists like to have. And this contextual information can really be important to demonstrate the authenticity of emails as well. So having information that tells you that an email was organized in a particular person's email folder, and this is the folder that it was in, and here are some other emails that were also in that folder, can give researchers a sense of the validity and authenticity of the information that they're looking at. If a researcher is able to see that an email that they're looking at is a part of a threaded reply that involves other people within an organization, then they can say, okay, well, I see that these other people have contributed to this email thread as well, and it looks like the email that I'm looking at kind of fits in with what other people are saying. So that gives me more confidence that what I'm looking at is a valid and authentic email. And again, having metadata that demonstrates, when something was sent, who it was sent by. Metadata can indicate if an email was read or not, can provide additional contextual clues that can help researchers determine, at least to a certain degree, maybe not a perfect degree, but to a certain degree, the authenticity of a particular email. So let's take email and connect the preservation of email to some of the different aspects of digital preservation that we've been talking about during this course, and to some of the different processes that archives engage in. So looking at access, in the prom draft report, they talk about having a PDF EA format, and prom argues that this is a format that is readily accessible because of the ubiquitous nature of PDF readers, and it's also a file format that is going to retain and provide vital information about the email. And that report also talks about some of the potential drawbacks of using other formats as opposed to the PDF EA format that Prom and their co-authors are recommending. Obviously, if archives don't preserve emails, then it's going to be very difficult to access them, right? You would have to go to the donor yourself as a researcher and say, can I look at your emails? And they might say, no buzz off. Authenticity is an interesting issue when it comes to email. The CLEAR report seems to favor emulation as a way to provide the most authentic representation of an email. So one that will show the features of an email as they would have appeared to the person who was writing the email at a given time. And we've talked about emulation before in this course. The CLEAR report also talks about some of the legal and proprietary reasons that might get in the way of these emulations taking place and being usable by archives. But it does seem to favor emulation over migration where possible. And the report is kind of cautious about migration and some of the changes that might occur during the migration process. So how archives choose to provide access to records, and if they're providing access to email files that have been migrated or email files that have been emulated, will impact the authenticity of the email that researchers are working with. Documentation, we talked about the need for metadata as far as understanding the context of emails and how that documentation can support the perception of authenticity that an email might have. Storage is an interesting one. So the CLEAR report talked about the huge volume of emails that just one person can create. And that can become a storage issue in and of itself. And then if you talk about having to preserve attachments contained within those emails, that's a whole nother storage issue. And then you can talk about the connection between preserving attachments in an authentic manner as well, and the choices of migration versus emulation that go into that consideration too. So yeah, it can get complicated and difficult pretty quickly. And it can really add up to requiring a lot of storage to, again, store not only the email files, but also the attachment files as well. Which of course relates to ideas of sustainability. If you are going to be preserving collections of emails that may contain thousands and thousands of email, how are you going to have any sense of what the content of those emails is? How are you going to understand what the different topics that are being discussed are, and how do you go about communicating that information to researchers? And that's something that the CLEAR report also talks about. And if you consider that email preservation is just one issue on top of a lot of other responsibilities that archives have, it can start to stretch archives pretty thin. Again, with sustainability, not only are you having to put resources into preserving the email messages themselves, but any attachments that might be associated with the email message also. So, that can impact the sustainability of an archive's user preservation programs as well. And then collaboration. I talked about collaborating with donors to help them or to help identify uh, which material in their email might be important. The CLEAR report has an interesting case study on page 69 of what that collaboration might look like. It's certainly helpful to have some collaboration between archivists and IT folks to help preserve these materials. Maybe archives need help using some of the tools that the CLEAR report mentions. And so that's certainly something that IT could help with. Making sure that all this stuff is stored adequately might be something that archives can work with IT to address. So there's definitely a lot of areas of collaboration when it comes to email preservation that archives can and should look into. So to connect the idea of email preservation to some of the topics that archives engage in, outreach can be a big one. If archives are proactive about promoting the value of archives and the worth of archives and the importance of archives, perhaps that can limit some of the email self-censorship that donors engage in. If donors value archives and feel that archives are trustworthy, then they might be more willing to donate maybe more sensitive or private material, which again can be very present in a person's email, and that's going to increase the overall value of the records that archives are preserving, which is certainly a good thing. Appraisal we've touched on already, but yeah, there can be just so many emails that one person creates that it's really important to try and identify which of those are truly important to retain into the future and which ones might be, spam or other emails that just aren't as important. So maybe you could try and do some kind of functional analysis to see which emails document a function that a person was involved in that might be particularly important, and go from there and try and limit as much as possible the amount of emails that archives are trying to wade through and provide access to. Records management is an interesting one. Again, if emails are considered to be outside of the records management or record retention schedule in an organization, then it's less likely that they'll be preserved. So perhaps archives could work to make sure that record schedules are more thorough about collecting emails from people within an organization, and maybe have longer retention periods, which might make it more likely that the records will end up into an archives at some point. So that would be a good connection with records management. And processing the metadata that archives collect and the contextual information that archives are hopefully able to collect when preserving email can make eventually describing email collections to researchers a whole lot easier and a whole lot more efficient. So the more proactive archives are about making sure that this information is collected on the front end, the less there is of kind of reinventing the wheel when it's time to process a collection containing email and making it available to the public. So these are just some connections that I came up with kind of off the top of my head a little bit. So I'm interested to see what kind of connections you come up with. And if you think of any sort of fun or interesting ones, be sure to let me know. I'm curious about what you think. Okay, so next we'll talk about website content. And as the Wickner article notes, website content is shaped by appraisal. So it's shaped by decisions that archivists make about which websites they are responsible for or feel responsible for. And that really shapes their efforts uh, of website archiving and website preservation. So, for instance, in the Graham article, the authors talk about how they focused on administrative records, faculty records, and student organizations. And they were focused on developing a priority for each identified website. So, what were they most interested in making sure that is included in the different crawls that they did to document websites, again, that they felt they had some responsibility to preserve. Another factor that can shape which content of a website is preserved or even which content exists is the uh, business decisions that companies make about which content is published on websites. So an organization might choose to say, we're not going to accept this type of content, or we're going to limit the content that people can post, and that can really shape the content that is available for archivists to preserve in the future. One disadvantage that archives have, is the Graham article notes, is that it can be difficult for archives to shape what this content is before it ends up in archival custody. So especially for businesses that may not be a part of an organization that an archive is a part of, it can be really difficult for archive to say, well, we would like you to have this kind of content on your website that is maybe in this format. Their archives may not have the kind of standing necessary to do that. Another aspect of website content that puts archives at a disadvantage is that it can be dynamic. It can be kind of constantly changing. Links can be changing. What videos are on a website at a given time might change. The images on a website might change. And so it's important for archives to make sure that they are documenting the content of a website in a way that uh, captures content fairly regularly, so that they're able to document how a website might change over time, maybe some of the contextual reasons for why a website is changing, uh, and attempting to provide as much of a understanding of these changes as is possible within the means of the archive. So a way that web archiving typically works, and this is something that the Wickner and Graham articles talk about, is web crawlers start out with a seed and then follow and copy links until the crawl reaches a limit determined by the archive. So it may start here, so kind of think of it as a tributary of a river or a basin of a river. So you have sort of the main branch of a website here, and then a crawler may go off into different directions and archive the content in these sort of smaller streams and creeks and whatever. But say at some point the archives tells the crawler, okay, once you reach this certain data limit, then stop. then that may prevent content that is maybe further afield from sort of the main archival website from being documented. And that can have implications in which content is preserved and which content is not preserved. If it's always the case where once the crawler gets to a certain point, it stops looking, then there might be important information contained in these smaller streams or creeks, but because the crawler sort of stops, that information might not be collected and archived by the website. So how far along the crawler goes can impact what content is collected and preserved. The Werkner article also talks about how archivists can determine which significant properties of a website should be collected. So they can tell the crawler, yes, we want you to collect videos. No, we don't want you to collect videos, and so on. And that can also have impacts on which content in a website is archived in the future as well. And the thing about the limits that are placed on crawlers, and thus the limits on what is and isn't collected, is, as the Wickner article notes, it may be difficult or impossible to know or communicate to the public what hasn't been collected. So if you don't know that something exists, then you might not necessarily know that it's not being collected, and that can result in a gap of information that you may not know even exists. Or it may be that the information never existed in the first place, but again, you might not be able to know that and communicate it to your researchers. So collecting the content that archives eventually preserve can stress the sustainability of an archives. Using tools like Archive-It, you pay for how much data you use, and if you only have so much money in your budget for web archiving, once you hit that, then that can really impact how much archiving you can do in the future. If you only have a staff member or maybe a half of a staff member working on web archiving, as the Wickner article notes, that can make it difficult to have a really thorough crawl done. So if you want to track down and recrawl specific pages because you feel like, okay, we didn't capture this well enough, if you only have a person who is able to devote 10 hours a week to web archiving, that can be a difficult thing to handle. And this can be problematic when, again, the dynamic nature of website content comes into play. So if there are broken links or other issues in a website, it might be difficult to sort of recrawl and attempt to fix that if you don't have the resources in place to be able to devote that kind of individualized and specific attention. And so that can result in a loss of content just because you're simply not able to provide enough resources to document things as thoroughly as you would like. And then, of course, you have to preserve the file created by the web crawl itself. So you have a crawl done that creates a crawl file, and then you have to preserve that crawl file. You have to preserve that content. So not only do you have to invest resources into doing the crawl itself, but also on top of that, having to provide the resources necessary to preserve the file that is produced by the crawl. So it can be a pretty resource intensive process. So to switch gears and talk about website context, so sort of the other side of the preservation coin, as Wickner notes, it's important for web archives to show multiple perspectives about events and processes. So instead of just having one perspective about an event or an occurrence, it's really necessary for archives to provide a more fuller contextual picture about why the events depicted in a particular website might occur. One problematic thing about web archives, as the Graham article notes, is that there's a lack of descriptive metadata standards to describe it. So there really isn't a very well developed language for what information about a website archivists should provide to researchers. And so that can result in some contextual information that might be important not being communicated to researchers in the future. And that can reduce their contextual understanding of what they're looking at, and that can make their research experience more difficult. So I talked about how the content of websites might change over time and the importance of crawling often enough to capture these changes. In addition to that, it's also important for archivists to provide contextual information about why changes took place. So the second case study that the Wickner article talks about how there was a change from labeling the response to hate crimes and other issues going on at the University of Maryland's campus, how it was sort of labeled in one way in the beginning, and then how it was labeled changed. And so Wickner argues that it's really important to understand why these changes took place and to provide researchers with an understanding of that change. Another thing about the context of a website is that it may depend on linking websites together to form a contextual whole. So this can be difficult as well. If you are attempting to connect a website from the University of Maryland with a website that might come from a local community group responding to issues at the University of Maryland, you have to kind of crosswalk those and provide some contextual reference between the two, just again, so researchers have a more complete understanding of what they're looking at and why they're seeing what they're seeing. Website context may also depend on records held by archives or others not available to the public. So getting this bigger picture may depend on researchers having access to records that are inaccessible for whatever reason. And another factor might be archival decisions about what might be considered in or out of bounds as far as website crawls. And that's something that the Graham article notes. So if an archive says, well, this is really beyond the purview of what we're looking for, then there might be information contained in a particular website or a particular part of a website that would have provided this contextual picture, but archivists are saying, well, we don't really feel like that's something that we need to document. So that can result in a loss of context as well. So again, it's important to have the actual content of the website preserved and accessible, but you have to place it within the bigger picture of an organization or within society and provide your researchers with information about how a website changed over time, maybe why it changed, and some of the issues that are behind why a researcher is seeing what they're seeing. Okay, and so we'll wrap things up by talking about the connection between website preservation and some of our preservation issues and some of our archival connections. So authenticity is an interesting one. If if a website is archived in 2002 and a researcher looks at it on a modern browser today, like the most recent version of Chrome, what they're seeing might be quite different from what the website looked like in the past. So I was looking at the Internet Archive today, and uh, how the record or how the archives look, it seems pretty authentic. But there are some changes in performance due just to the changes in browsers, change to the extensions that browsers might have that can impact how an archive website looks and feels. Documentation, we talked about the importance of context in contextual documentation for it, and metadata, especially descriptive metadata. Looking at storage, websites can be pretty big. And if you look at all the websites that in one university, like the University of Nebraska, is responsible for, that can result in a lot of data that archives need to store long term in order to provide access to all these different crawls, that may be done fairly regularly. So storage can be a big concern as well. Sustainability, we talked about how websites preservation can be really resource intensive, and there may not be the staff to engage in this kind of activity. The Graham article really notes about how kind of under-resourced web archiving has been in the past, and obviously that can be a concern as well. Collaboration. It might be helpful to work with donors to find out, or not donors, but people in the community or people in your organization to have more of an idea of which websites or which parts of a website might be the most important to document, so you know how to direct the crawls that your website or your archive engages in. So that would be a good opportunity for collaboration. Again, working with IT to develop or to implement some of the tools. Maybe if you need help working with Archiveit, that can be an opportunity to work with IT. And again, just collaborating to work through some of the digital preservation issues that archives have to navigate through when they are preserving the files created by web archive crawls. Okay, so connecting it to outreach. It's always helpful for archives to communicate why website preservation is important, and that may help them get some of the resources that they need to do it. Say, well, documenting our website is a vital way to document the history of our campus and how our organization has changed over time. And, it takes money to have enough data to use Archiveit. It takes staff time to make sure that we're documenting what we should be documenting, and just making the case for why website preservation is important. Appraisal, there's a lot of websites out there, and you just have to make sure that you are engaging in some process to make sure that you've identified the most important websites for preservation. Records management, making sure that information is available to help provide context to information contained on a website. So if there is a website from 2002 that says, see this report for more information, that this report actually exists somewhere and in some form, that would be a really helpful thing. Processing the Graham article demonstrates how they place their website archiving within the context of finding aids and within the context of their collections. An interesting one is social justice, which is one that the Wickner article touches on, using or making sure that archives are collecting websites that represent a diverse viewpoint and diverse perspectives in society, and including that in appraisal decisions, and making sure that that the choices that archives make when appraising websites don't kind of compound inequality and compound silences in society that may already exist. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. I hope that the readings for this week and this lecture have helped you know more about some of the different issues facing the preservation of email and websites. Doing both can be really complicated and large-scale issues, but important ones for archives to engage in, because email and website can provide a whole lot of very vital information about a person, about an organization, and they're just such vital ways that people communicate today. And if archives just kind of put their heads in the sand and say, well, we're not going to bother thinking about this, then a lot of information is going to be lost into the future, which is obviously something that archives at their core exists to prevent from happening. So these are two issues that archives really need to address. It seems like there's been a lot of progress in figuring out how to preserve both these things, but certainly, as with all things related to digital preservation, a lot of important work to be done into the future as well. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for listening, and be well.